Our topic today touches each and every one of us, the food and drinks that we consume and how they impact the environment.
It's all about, fighting climate change to feed the world. 30% of carbon emissions come from the agri-food industry. What happens when you have, lower yields and outputs that are caused by climate change? Our food insecurity rates are, somewhere in the neighborhood of around 18%. The first step in lowering carbon emissions is to be able to measure those carbon emissions. And the more food you have available for human consumption across the world, the less the rate of food insecurity is. Anytime you can eliminate waste from the business, you're going to eliminate costs from the business. And it's actually a better way to make a bigger profit. Canada plays a significant role in not only feeding Canadians, but feeding the entire world.
This is where it's actually leading us towards a world where there will be more regulations over carbon emissions.
Our solution reduces both cost and time by well over 90%. The screws are not getting any looser, right, around regulation. My vision is, could we get to the point where simply you push a button, it measures your footprint, tells you exactly how to reduce it, and then, spits out a report.
Hi there, and welcome back to the Beyond Product podcast. My name is Moshe Mikanovsky, and I'm your host. In this podcast, we are diving deep into what goes into making truly successful and impactful digital products. We're exploring the unspoken, the behind the scenes, and everything under the hood of product development. Our topic today touches each and every one of us, the food and drinks that we consume, and how they impact the environment. In the past decade, we have seen many climate change-related issues being solved or tackled via technology. Our guest today does just that. Brett Wills is the co-founder and CEO of Carbon One, and his vision is very clear. We need to use technology to fight climate change to feed the world. Brett is an expert in this industry. He has spent decades helping organizations be more sustainable and eco-friendly. He is a professor of sustainable business management, and he also authors 2 books on the subject. At Carbon One, he built a SaaS-based carbon accounting and reporting solution for Canadian food and beverage companies. Through their platform, Carbon One helps these companies prepare for carbon reporting requirements and educate consumers about carbon emission levels created by the product they consume. Carbon One is building a huge momentum in the industry. They were named top 10 finalists in Green Pursuit Pitch, a national Agritech pitch competition through Bio Enterprise, Canada's food and Agritech engine. Please give warm welcome to Brett. I'm so excited to have you on the show.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Absolutely. And I'm really excited because that one vision that you have about how technology help, feed the world is huge. And I really want to ask you just upfront, how do we connect the dots from technology to actually feeding the world?
Yeah, it's a great question. Really, if you think about it in our case, it's all about, fighting climate change to feed the world. And the way that we connect the dots is that, if you look at the agricultural industry or the entire agri-food industry, it emits a significant portion of the global carbon emissions that are driving climate change. So, globally, it's somewhere around 30% of carbon emissions come from the agri-food industry. And then if you sort of play that out, what you see is that, as more carbon emissions go into the atmosphere and it fuels climate change itself has a significant impact on the agricultural industry in the form of lower yields and lower outputs that are caused by droughts and floods and all of these types of things. So it sort of becomes this vicious circle, right? And by being able to reduce the amount of carbon emissions, it's going to help fight climate change. And if you help fight climate change, it's going to improve yields and outputs. And what happens when you have, lower yields and outputs that are caused by climate change it drives food insecurity, right? Because there's less food being produced in the world. There's more people in the world that need that food. And if you look at food
Hmm.
insecurity rates across the world, it can be as high as 20, 25%. Here in Canada alone, our food insecurity rates are, somewhere in the neighborhood of around 18%, which is significant. That's over
Hmm.
5 million people in, our relatively, low population country here, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying
Absolutely.
to help companies reduce the amount of carbon emissions that come from the agri-food sector to lessen the impact on climate change, which will reduce the climate change impacts on agriculture, resulting in higher yields, higher outputs, more food for people to eat, and therefore we help reduce food insecurity. And then, of course, the first step
Mm.
in lowering carbon
Hmm.
emissions is to be able to measure those carbon emissions. And that's where we really got started with Carbon One, is to help companies measure their carbon emissions, not only directly from their own facilities and operations, but across their entire value chain.
I see. Okay. So if we are looking at specifically reducing the emission, which is the targets, many countries have signed the Paris Accord and other accords to reduce those emissions and to get to specific levels. How is it directly impacting the increase in yield of food? Is there a direct
Sure,
correlation?
there's both a direct and indirect correlation, I guess, right? So there's a number of targets that have been committed to across the world. It can get quite confusing, right? Because there's certain targets that apply to countries
Mm.
and other targets that apply to private organizations. Um, but when you commit to reducing your carbon emissions, whether as a country or a government or a private organization, in our case, we're dealing with the food and beverage sector. It reduces the amount of carbon emissions not only from, like, say, a CPG manufacturer, but across the entire supply chain of that CPG manufacturer, all the way down to the farm. So as we reduce the amount of carbon
Mm.
emissions that come from the agri-food industry, as mentioned, about 30% globally, we're going to reduce the amount of carbon and
Right.
greenhouse gases that go into the atmosphere, which will reduce the climate change impacts. You reduce those climate change impacts, you take the pressure off the agri-food industry, you lessen the amount of droughts, you lessen, the amount of floods, and all of the other sort of externalities that come from climate change. And that directly results in higher
Right.
yields, right? Because if you have less floods,
Mhm.
less droughts, you can get the full harvest from those crops, right? So it allows you to directly,
Yeah.
um, increase those yields, increase those outputs. And just to sort of simplify it here, Moshe, is that the more yield and the more output you have from farms, for example, the more food that is available for human consumption across the world. And the more food you have available for human
Mhm.
consumption across the world, the less the rate of food insecurity is, and then therefore, you help to feed the world at the end of the day.
Right, right. Now there is also an economic
Of course.
aspect of that as well, because although it's the emissions is up to 30% of all different carbon emissions out there, the GDP that is created from food and beverage industry is really just around 1.5 in Canada, maybe 1.67 or something like that. So there is also supposed to be a bit of encouragements for the industry to become more economically viable and create maybe increases GDP as their portion in that. Is that right? The
Yeah, yeah,
product,
sure.
right?
So, I would say that there's a significant amount of people that are employed in the food manufacturing CPG business, and what I've prior to starting Carbon One, I was running a sustainability consulting business for 15 years, and um, had the opportunity to work with a few hundred food and beverage processors across the country. And
Hmm.
what I always told these companies is that, carbon or any environmental impact is another form of waste inside of the business, right? So, um, anytime you can
Mm-hmm.
eliminate waste from the business, you're going to eliminate cost from the business, right? So, what I've always told people is, whether it's carbon or whether it's any of this other environmental stuff, this isn't some sort of lefty tree hugger movement that's nice to work on when you have extra time on your hands. It's a critical component to
Yeah.
competing and winning, and it's actually a better way to make a bigger profit. So, what we see over and over again is companies who focus on, reducing their environmental impact. In the case where we're focused on carbon, if you can reduce carbon emissions, not only does it have those environmental benefits and social benefits, but it also has direct economic benefits to the business, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, when you're reducing carbon emissions, when you talk about carbon, it seems like this magical thing, right? It's hot air and it's hard to sort of put your finger on it. But if you think about what causes carbon emissions, it's things like the use of electricity, right? The use of fuels, the use of natural gas to heat your facilities, those types of things, which are all
Mm-hmm.
costs to a business. So when you're working on reducing your carbon emissions, you're reducing those inputs or those variables. And if you can reduce electricity and you reduce natural gas usage and fuel usage and reduce transportation, at the end of the day, what you're really doing is reducing costs, right? Um, so if you use less energy, you spend less money. And that is really important to the overall competitiveness of Canada's agri-food sector. It's a very challenging sector to be in. Every sector is challenging, but when you look at the agri-food sector, they've been dealing with a number of challenges for decades now, right? So whether it comes to labor, whether it comes to high levels of regulation and oversight, um, and they're operating on razor thin margins. So any dollar that a food company can save, helps to protect and strengthen margins, which allows them to grow and hire more people and feed more people. And I think it's
Yeah.
important to note that Canada plays a significant role in not only feeding Canadians, but feeding the entire world. So we play a big part in this.
Absolutely. No, so that's great because what we are saying here is that the target of reducing the carbon emission is beneficial to feed the world, is beneficial for each consumers, directly, and it's also beneficial for the organizations that are in that industry and to the overall economy. So it seems like a win-win-win
It is,
situation over there for
absolutely.
everyone. Yeah. Absolutely. Now, you also touched a bit about regulations that they're highly regulated, etc., and also about the commitments of government to reduce their emissions, etc. This is where it's actually leading us towards a world where there will be a more regulations over carbon emissions, or at least reporting your carbon emissions. Tell us a bit about that, and from that we can then dive into the product because the product helps with that as
Yeah,
well.
absolutely. So, things are getting really interesting here. The agri-food industry, particularly in Canada, has a lot of regulations and oversight, things around food safety and traceability. But what we're seeing is that, things are really heating up on the carbon side of things. And at Carbon One, we believe, and
Mhm.
there's lots of evidence that backs this, that carbon accounting and reporting will become as commonplace as financial accounting and reporting within the next few years, well before 2030.
Mhm.
And there's a number of things that are driving
Mhm.
that, as you mentioned. One of them, and one of the main drivers, is regulations around carbon reporting. And what's coming down the pipe quite quickly, actually, is mandated reporting for all publicly traded companies in Canada. And this isn't just happening in Canada.
Mhm.
This is happening in the US under the Securities and Exchange Commission. It's already been adopted in other
Right.
countries around the world, such as Brazil. And basically, what this requires is publicly traded companies in Canada to report their carbon emissions on an annual basis along with
Mhm.
their annual financial filings. Now, the kicker here is
Mhm.
that when these publicly traded companies are required to report their carbon emissions, it's not only their direct emissions from their own operations and facilities. It also includes what's called Scope 3 carbon emissions, which covers carbon
Mm.
emissions from across the entire value chain. So, all the way down to the farm and all the way out essentially to the consumer. So, while there's not a
Mhm.
lot of publicly traded food and beverage companies in Canada. All the retailers, or most of the major retailers, are. There's a few, large CPG players that are publicly traded. But what's going to happen is there's going to be this ripple effect across the entire agri-food industry. Because if I'm a retailer that's
Right.
publicly traded, and now I have to report the carbon emissions of my supply chain, I'm now going to require that all of my suppliers who are selling me or shipping me their products to sell in my stores, I'm going to need them to report the carbon emissions of their operations and their products to me. So while the regulation only
Right. Right.
covers publicly traded companies, because it includes the scope 3 value chain and supply chain emissions, it essentially casts a net over the entire industry. So that's one of the regulations we're seeing. What we're also seeing is international regulations that are starting to impact Canadian
Mm.
companies, right? So we have
Mhm.
mandatory reporting requirements coming out of the EU that are now starting to touch some of the larger, Canadian food companies who are exporting into the EU. We have another
Mhm.
regulation that's been introduced in the EU that's also being looked at here in Canada and the US, which is called the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And basically, what that is meant to
Mhm.
do is level the playing field between trading partners around carbon pricing. So, for example, here in Canada, we're at $85 per ton as a carbon price, but there's some countries around the world that are at $100 a ton. So if a Canadian company is going to ship into another country that has a higher carbon price, there's going to be a levy or a tax applied at the border to level that playing field. The only way to do that is to be able to measure and report your carbon emissions, right? So yeah, and we're seeing this play out. We know that some of the retailers are already starting to send out suppliers or surveys to their suppliers, and we know that everything starts with a
Yeah.
survey, right? So we are seeing things move quite quickly
Yeah.
on this.
Yeah. And that's where I really want it. It's a good segue into the product itself because what those companies sometimes don't understand is that it goes not just from the suppliers, but is their suppliers and their suppliers. So it goes all the way from raw material, and that's where agriculture is starting. Like, where do they grow some of the materials that they have to, and then where do they process them? How do they transport them over, etc. So card one, the product, carbon one, sorry. So carbon one, the product, the platform actually support all of this full path. Tell us a bit about that. How did you create that?
Yeah, so good question. I guess just for a little bit of context here, the majority of carbon emissions of any company or any product is scope 3, which is the supply chain emissions. It's 80% or more.
Mhm.
And this is
Right.
quite a complex thing to do. It's a complex calculation. I won't get into the details of that. But when we created Carbon One, we we really looked to solve this problem for particularly Canadian food and beverage companies, because the existing solutions on the market are really manual solutions where you would have to hire a specialized consultant to do what's called a life cycle analysis on your products and your supply chain. It can cost tens of thousands of dollars per product, take months to complete, and it's something that has to be updated on an annual basis. So, we felt that, the timing was right and the technology had finally caught up. And if we could find the right technology partner to work with, that we could build a solution that would automate this process to drastically reduce not only the time involved, but also remove the requirement to have specialized knowledge and capability in this area. And then, of course, anytime we introduce technology, we're also going to drop the cost down. So our solution reduces both the cost and time of measuring these scope 3 emissions, particularly the emissions, the life cycle emissions of a food and beverage product. Our solution reduces both cost and time by well over 90%. It is.
Wow, that's huge. 90% from doing it manually to
Correct.
using the platform. Amazing. So your background was, you mentioned you've done it for 15 years, so you have probably helped companies already with that, creating scope 3 calculations, and you were able to measure how long it took to do it without the platform versus how long it takes it with the platform. What are we talking about, like in days? But I'm sure it's different between type of organizations or the number of products that they have. But can you give us a bit of idea there, like time wise? How long does it take
Yeah.
to
So,
do that?
just to be candid, my specialty and expertise was not necessarily in life cycle assessments or the scope 3 stuff. I was more of a scope 1 and 2 guy. One of the other co-founders of
Hmm.
Carbon One, our chief science officer, Panos, he really brings the expertise to the table there. And it can
Hmm.
take months to do this manually. Anywhere
Hmm.
from 2 up to 6 months, depending on the type of product and complexity of the supply chain behind that product. So it's a significant investment of time.
Hmm.
We've talked to some of our customers right now, and they would joke that they would have to lock themselves in a room for months at a time to be able to do this, and we've just freed them from that. So it can take a long time.
Hmm. Amazing. And what type of data did you need to have to actually make those automation or make the calculation automatically, so you don't have to for every situation go and
Yeah,
find the
great
number?
question. What this really comes down to is data, right? So, um, you know, the data that we use is special data. It's called emissions factors, and we tap into various sources for our data. So, for example, we can tap into various paid databases. Uh, that their business model is to produce, these emissions factors. And just for context, what an emissions factor is that if I'm growing, let's say, wheat on a farm,
Hmm.
there's a certain amount of carbon emissions that are released into the atmosphere as a result of growing a commodity or raising a commodity on a farm, right? And that includes everything from
Hmm.
the fuel use in the tractors to the fertilizers and pesticides and things like that are applied to the fields. If you're looking at animals,
Hmm.
it's the methane that they produce from just existing. So all of these things have to be factored into how much emissions is released into the atmosphere from growing a kilogram or a bushel of wheat or raising a cow or a pig or a chicken. And there are studies that have been done on this. And so we tap into the various databases, academic studies, industry studies, and feed them into our database that users of our platform can access instantaneously. Um, And normally, what you would have to do is you'd have to sit down with a consultant, understand exactly what emissions factors are required. That consultant would then have to go away and spend days, if not weeks, trying to find all of those specific emissions factors. And what
Mhm.
we've done is we've consolidated them all into one place essentially and made them readily available at our users' fingertips. And
I
for
can see.
anything that we don't have in our
Sorry.
database, we've got
Hmm.
tools built into our platform that allow users to immediately request a new emissions factor for a specific ingredient or from a specific region, and then we go and find that for them.
I see. Yeah, I can see how that will take forever for every
Yeah.
company to do it on their own. So just the value of that is amazing. Um, if you think also about where that bushel of wheat has been grown, is there different emissions like or different calculation or data based on whether it was like in North America versus Europe versus Asia? Is that also
Absolutely,
part of
good
that?
question. So, yes, and it can even vary by region, right? It certainly in Canada would vary by province. The emissions of growing, a kilogram of one specific commodity in Ontario will be much different than if you're growing it in Alberta or if you're growing it in Newfoundland. And the reason for that is there's a number of variables and factors at play here. So it's, how is the power generated in that region? Is it coal, nuclear, solar, wind, whatever it may be?
Hmm.
It's weather plays a significant factor, farming methods and
Okay.
processes, all
Hmm.
these types of things, factor into the amount of emissions that come from a commodity. And then of course when you look globally, the variability in those numbers can be quite significant, right? So you're also taking into consideration things like, has the land been cleared recently, right? So if you look at some places like Brazil, who has cleared land quite recently to do farming, that has to be factored into the equation. And there's certain parts of the world where the emissions are multiples or an order of magnitude higher than it is in other parts of the world.
Yeah, this makes it such a complex data collection and data, understanding each one of those locations. So I can definitely see how a kilogram of wheat can have so many different variables, and that's just one raw material. If we dive a bit more into the product, so just very briefly, if you can describe, the process of how does a company that will use it are able to calculate their emission for a specific product.
Yeah, so basically the way it works, it's actually super simple for any brand to set up. They simply create an account on our platform. You can go to carbon-one.ca and sign up and register there.
Mhm.
Um, Once you've created an account, you'll simply start creating a new product right away, and you're going to enter some specific information around your product characteristics. And then you will be asked a number of questions relating to your product and your supply chain. You simply have to answer these questions, enter information related to your product, and then simply click next and click calculate. And our system does all of the heavy lifting and all the calculations behind the scene. And once you've entered all the information that is required, you submit that final footprint to us for review and approval. We have an approval process in place where we review it according to all the internationally recognized standards and protocols. And if it meets all of the requirements, we then
Mm,
approve it and issue a certificate of approval.
I see. I see. Now, the product I've seen also can generate a label with the emission for a specific package of goods. So let's say I'm a manufacturer of cookies and I put all the information and you approved my calculations, then it could create that label. Is the intention there is to use that label in the packaging so the consumers can
Yeah,
also see the
absolutely,
emission?
right. So, we see the natural evolution of product labeling moving towards having a carbon label on it. Um, sort of a fun fact. Not sure if many people are aware of this, but nutrition labels on food products were not required or mandatory in all products until 2007 in Canada. And today, I don't
Mm-hmm.
think that we can imagine going to a grocery store and not seeing a nutrition label on a food
Bottom
product, right? And
line.
so what we
Yeah.
see as sort
Mhm.
of the natural evolution here is the carbon impact or the climate impact of a product will be labeled right there on the package. And basically what that carbon label is doing is it's very similar to a nutrition label, right? So a nutrition label tells you what the health impacts of that product is, right? By showing you the
Mhm.
amount of sodium that is in that product or protein or whatever it may be. The carbon label is doing essentially the same
Right.
thing, but instead of showing you what the health impact of the product is, it's showing you specifically what the climate impact of that product is by showing you how many kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent were released into the atmosphere
Mhm.
as a result of producing that product all the way from the farm to the shelf.
Now, the interesting thing for me would be what would consumer react to when they see that? I mean, because me as a consumer, you're right. I mean, I do look at nutrition values because I started getting used to that. I want the health of my kids, so I can compare different products and stuff like that. I'm thinking with that, if there are two competing labels that have one has less emission than the other, then maybe I will choose that one if I'm aware enough. Is that what you're seeing from your looking at consumers and how they might use that?
That's the question, right? So you could probably do a whole podcast just on this topic alone. And to be candid, it's hard to say. We believe, and there's evidence to show that people care about the impact of their food, right? They care about where the food's coming from, the impact it has on the environment. The challenge that we're seeing is that there's so many factors that influence the food choices of a consumer, and it's not always clear how much each of those factors impacts purchasing decisions, right? So just think of yourself when you go to a grocery store, or when I go to a grocery store. I'm not looking at just one thing, or I'm not factoring in just one thing when I make a choice on what food I'm going to buy. I'm thinking about particularly these days, price is probably top of mind. The health benefits or impacts, where it was made, right?
Yeah, I've seen also political decisions made or decisions made based on politics. I've
Yeah,
seen as well. So, so it's
I
absolutely
think.
yeah.
Yeah,
I
just
guess.
to add
Mhm.
another point here, Moshe. I think also what challenge we're seeing is a lack of awareness in the marketplace and confusion with consumers on can I believe what companies are telling me? And if I go and I Google something, I see something different. And I think that part of that stems from the lack of global or national standards, the lack of harmonization between standards. Um, those
Right.
types of things. Um, you know, this whole concept of greenwashing, where you're over embellishing, the environmental attributes of a product or thing like that. I think the good news is that what we're seeing is we're
Mhm.
seeing a harmonization of standards across not only the country but the world. We're seeing, harmonization of regulations. We're seeing, regulations come out to prevent things like greenwashing. So, for example, just last week in the European Union, they
Mhm.
released a new greenwashing standard that basically puts regulations around any environmental claims that you're making. So you can no longer just put out an environmental claim without having the evidence to back it up, right? And I think that will be a big
Mm.
thing for consumers, right? Consumers being able to trust
Right.
what, the information that's being put out there, and being able to compare
Absolutely.
from one company or product to another. So I think that will help things along for sure.
And I can absolutely see how Carbon One and what you're building now can be right there in setting the standards,
Yeah.
being part of the standards, and helping consumers really understand it. So when you started the company, when you realized, yes, there is a problem here that I need to solve, and you started Carbon One, did you think more about the consumer angle or more about the industry, the food and beverage industry, manufacturing, or was it kind of like both?
It was kind of both, but it's funny you asked that because it's this entrepreneurial journey or founder journey. You start out with a focus on one thing, and that quickly evolves over time, right? So when we founded the
Yeah.
company, we really founded the company to um, personally, we wanted to amplify our impact. The founders had been working in this space for a long time, and we felt that the impact that we're having wasn't what we were necessarily looking for or felt we could achieve. So we really wanted to amplify our impact. We saw this as an opportunity to amplify our impact by solving a real problem for food and beverage companies. And originally, when we started the
Mhm.
company, we felt that we were going to solve this problem by producing a carbon label, and that this is something that they could share with their consumers and would also give them some insight. We quickly realized that
Mhm.
maybe the appetite for a carbon label wasn't quite there yet, but the appetite for these numbers and to understand where what the emissions were, first of all, the extent of those emissions and where they were. So very quickly after we launched, we realized that we're going to focus more on supporting the food and beverage company, and that over time that would
Mhm.
translate and reach the consumer.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense, and it also brings to mind with the regulators, what do they um, care more about? Is it consumers and their protection? Is it the environment and its protection? Different regulators, different countries with their politics and whatever, they do different things. They have more emphasis on one versus the other. Have you seen any trends there?
Yeah, lots of trends. I think the main trend is the screws are not getting any looser, right, around regulations, and I think that we need to differentiate between you know the the regulations and policy, right? So I think there's a confusion in the marketplace around carbon accounting and reporting and the carbon tax or carbon price, right? So you know we can have a whole discussion around the carbon price and whether that works or not, and if a new government forms, will it still exist or will it still be here? That's a whole other conversation. When it comes to carbon accounting and reporting, that's separate from the carbon price. So the carbon price could disappear completely, right? You're still going to have carbon accounting and reporting. Um, and the general trend is that um, we're seeing more and more regulations come down across the world. we're seeing that those regulations are getting wider and wider. So they're not just national or regional, they're international. What we're also seeing from a trend is that it's including additional impacts, right? So previously, there were some regulations around what's called scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions, which is basically direct emissions from company owned and controlled assets or their own facilities and operations. But a couple of years ago, that was expanded to this scope 3 stuff, which is the supply chain, entire value chain. Now, we're starting to see that the regulations are expanding even beyond carbon to include things like water, right? Or even the introduction very recently this year of the modern day slavery act, which is just crazy that we have to have regulations around that in 2024, but we do, right? So if I'd say there's a general trend, the screws are getting tighter around this, not looser.
Now, I believe that if we're going back to the product, I believe you also have some AI component in it. How does everyone loves to talk about AI these days? How do you utilize AI to help with Carbon One?
Yeah, so interesting times, right? With AI. So I like to say that we're leaning into AI as an organization, but we're doing it strategically. And we're doing it across the organization. We're using it to help drive operational excellence, make ourselves more efficient. This whole idea of being able to do more with less type of thing. We're also using it to be able to better serve our customers and meet their needs in a timely fashion, as well as enhance the capabilities of our platform. I really can't give too much away in terms of specifically what we're doing right now, but what I will say is that we are leaning in. We are making sure that we're doing it in a slow and controlled manner, by doing lots of testing, making sure that we're training the AI bots properly, that we're putting the proper guardrails in place, that there's always a human checkpoint with AI. But we're using it from a customer service perspective, which I think a lot of companies are now, but also from a task
Right.
related perspective. So we we almost consider that some of our team members are not humans, right? They're specifically created AI bots that perform a specific task or function. And
Hmm.
might
Hmm.
seem kind of silly, but we actually even give them names, right? So, we've got one that helps us with marketing, and his name is Markety Mark, and we invite them to our meetings so that they can stay up to date on what we're doing, and we're continually training them.
Yeah.
We're still at the very early stages, but we see it as certainly part of our overall strategy as a business moving forward. Just have to make sure that we're managing it properly and we've got the proper guardrails and checkpoints in place here.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's a good way to go at that, especially that it's although it seems like a huge boom and a huge like it's everywhere AI, we still need to trust it, and that trust is something that you gain over time, like with anyone else. So I see the point of doing it strategically like that. And another thing is also we will discuss a bit later about your founder journey and startup journey, etc. It sounds like this is an exciting date as well for startups that they can don't always have to go to hire a new person
Yeah.
for something like that. You can use some of those tools to help you with some of those activities that you don't need a full time person
That
sometimes,
that's right, and
right?
I think that that's what we're seeing right now in terms of a lot of the benefits that AI can provide. If I have any advice for people out there, it's make sure you take your time with this. Don't sort of get overexcited to launch something, and make sure that you have the right people and partners, right? That understand this AI. We're not developers ourselves. We've got a great partner, Quotient, that understands this, and they've been a huge support for us in terms of some of the stuff that we're trying to launch right now in our platform, such as a chatbot
Mhm.
around AI, and it's important that you have the
Yeah.
right partners in place that can give you the guidance and advice, because as we've seen, as good as AI can be, it can also cause you challenges and backfire on you, right? So you want to be very careful with how you roll that out, and make sure that you've got people on your team that understand it, and can support you with that.
Yeah. No, great tip over there to have the right partners
Mhm.
that can help you with that. Um, what's next for your product? What do you see the future? Where does it grow into?
Yeah, we're planning all kinds of things. I think that what we always say to our customers is we're making it simple and affordable for Canadian food and beverage companies to measure, improve, and communicate the carbon footprint of their operations as well as their products, right? So we've started with and put a lot of effort and time into being able to measure very accurately according to internationally recognized standards. Product carbon footprints as part of Scope 3. Next, what we'll be moving towards is how do we expand the capabilities to include other Scope 3 categories, for example, but then also expand the features and capabilities of our platform, so that we can provide more value when it comes to improving or reducing those emissions and being able to communicate or report those out to their stakeholders, right? So
Yeah.
essentially,
For
yeah, go
example.
ahead. Sorry.
Mhm. Yeah. I just wanted to like let's talk maybe an example. I was thinking more about the data because you're collecting a lot of data there. But maybe there is another example that you're referring to. To be able to expose more information to the
Yeah, so
stakeholders.
in terms of the data is something that we're very focused on. We're always working towards better quality data, getting data from different sources,
Mhm.
potentially generating the data on our own. It is sort of a differentiator and a strong source of IP for us. So can't get too much into that, but what I can say is that we are working on increasing the quality of our data, making our data more granular and timely, to increase the accuracy
Mhm.
of our measurements. In terms of the reduction in
Exactly.
communication pieces, it's giving people the intelligence that they need to accelerate their reduction efforts. We've started that with some of the
Mhm.
standard stuff, such as heat maps or hotspot identification. But what we want to move towards next is
Mhm.
how do we actually build things into the platform that will essentially reduce those carbon emissions. So whether it's best practices or
Oh,
tips and tricks, those types of things.
oh,
My vision,
yeah.
for the business over time is that, and maybe this sounds a little silly, um, but it's net zero automated, right? So my vision is, could we get to the point where simply you push a button, it measures your footprint, tells you exactly how to reduce it, and then spits out a report that shows what your footprint is, in a matter of seconds. So we'll see how close
So
we can get to
really, that
that.
doesn't sound. Yeah, that doesn't sound silly at all. It sounds great to me. It's almost like I'm paralleling this with the other products that I'm familiar with that are more on product management and how do we understand from the data that we're collecting about how people are using the product to where are the areas that we need to improve it. So here, with all the data that you're collecting, all the process of understanding where is more emission, where is less emission, creating insights to the different stakeholders of the organization that can say you have to improve on transportations or you have to improve in this specific process. Is that's the
Yeah,
idea, right?
and specific to food and beverage companies, it's, you're using this ingredient from, this country. Why don't you try using this ingredient from this country because it's got lower emissions at the farm level? You'll have less transportation, therefore you'll have lower emissions there. And
Mm.
if you swap these two ingredients out, it'll lower your footprint by X.
Do you do also what ifs, like, or do
Yeah,
you plan to
yeah,
do what
yeah.
ifs
We
like
we
that?
we we do allow what ifs in our platform right now. We're looking at how do we build that out, and that's been some great feedback that we've had from some of our current users is that not only can you use this information to say what is or what was, right, is you can use this to say what could be, right. So what we're finding is
Hmm.
that food and beverage companies are now incorporating the carbon impact into product development and design, right? So it's no longer,
Right.
we sit down and, this is our checklist for a new product. It has to meet, this taste profile, this cost profile, so on and so forth. It also needs to meet these carbon requirements or these climate requirements, right?
Right.
And our
Right.
platform, supports them in that product development process.
Right. What about moving to the other areas of the supply chain, like providing the product, the carbon one, to the farmers or to the transportations? Is that also a place where the product can go?
Potentially, it is. It's something that we're looking into. I think that when you look at the agri-food value chain, um, the the food and beverage manufacturers and processors, they're obviously connected to the farmers, but the farming challenge is to us a much bigger challenge. And it does
Mm.
need to be addressed because that's where a majority of the agri-food emissions come from is at the farm level. It's something
Right.
that is certainly on our radar. Yeah.
Okay, so we touched a bit before about the founder journey, and I want to dive a little bit more about that because you do have like everyone has a great founder journey, whether they're successful or not, and you have a great story as well there because you didn't start it as a technical person, and now you're building a SaaS product. So how was that transition to become a founder of a SaaS company?
Yeah, it was interesting, and I'm sure every founder would say that, right? So, it's interesting when you sort of look back and reflect on how you got where you are today, and I look back and go, wow, I never planned that, but somehow all the stars aligned here. 25 years of experience before I founded Carbon One, 10 of that in industry, and 15 of that as a sustainable business management consultant. And, I had the opportunity to work with, a few hundred companies across North America, really. And I got to a point in my career that I imagine a lot of people get to, where you sort of you know keep asking yourself, what am I doing? Is this really adding value? Am I having the impact that I want to have? And it got to the point where I really felt like the impact that I was having as a consultant, wasn't as broad or as
Mhm.
deep as it could be. So, started looking and thinking about, how could I expand and deepen that impact. And I think, as I had mentioned earlier, we saw that these regulations were coming down the pipe, and we knew how difficult and complex and expensive it would be for food and beverage companies to be able to, first of all, measure and calculate these numbers, never mind reducing them. And we saw a great opportunity to
Hmm.
sort of mesh this opportunity to increase our impact, but also, play this key role in strengthening the competitiveness of Canada's agri-food sector to, not only continue feeding Canadians, but, because Canada plays such a large role in feeding the world, to continue feeding the world. And we we basically set out to solve this problem. And when we started, we had no real idea how we were going to do this. Um, and
Right.
we knew technology had to sort of play a role here. But I sort of joke, but it's also kind of true that prior to founding Carbon One, I was lucky if I could recover a password, right? Like, um, never mind, like if someone had said to me, "What's an SQL database?" I would look at them sideways, right? And we had no idea
But
about this stuff,
don't worry about,
right? And
yeah, don't worry about that recovery.
so,
Sorry, I want to say, don't worry about that recovery of password, because after 30 years in technology, I still
yeah,
struggle with that sometimes. So that's a common problem
right.
for everyone, I think.
Right, and we didn't know how to go about designing, a platform or a system like this. So, the first thing that we did is we looked at how do we solve the science part of this problem, and then we realized very quickly that we were going to
Mhm.
need a technology platform for us to do that. So we spent a lot of time, looking for the right partner. And we talked to many
Mm.
third-party developers. We went back and forth on, do we do this internally, and do we try and educate ourselves, or do we work with an external partner, and interviewed a bunch. And that's how we ended up starting with our Q, as we call them, Root Quotient, and very quickly
Yeah.
saw that there was no way that we were going to get up to speed in time to be able to bring this thing to market without a partner who has the right experience and knowledge in doing that. So
Yeah.
um, yeah, that's really how we got started, and here we are almost 2 years later.
Amazing, amazing. Yeah, you identify the problem that is a real problem, and that's usually one of the hardest things to really do. Once you identify that problem and you know that this is a real problem because you have some validation, you have feedback from the industry, you know the industry in and out. Then partnering and finding the right ways to do that are things that you can learn. You also mentioned to me when we talked that you really use the community for that. So you're a very strong opponent of a community or building with the community. Tell me a bit more about that, because which community did you reach out to and how did they help you?
Yeah, by community, I think you mean sort of the agri-food community, or here in Canada, or the
Yeah,
founders
founders
community.
community,
Oh, geez, yeah.
the founders.
Um, one of the things that I found out very quickly when founding Carbon One is that there is this community of founders, not only locally but across the country. And I was surprised, maybe I shouldn't have been, at how willing other founders were to just hop on a call with you, right? And chat about their experiences and some of the challenges that they've had. And to be able to connect you with, some people in their network, right? People that I had never met once, right? And, just connected with on LinkedIn, or someone else introduced me to them. And, you sort of are sheepish and ask if, would you be willing to have a call type thing? And yeah, for sure, right? And you're like, wow. So for us, it was, invaluable, right? Being able to learn from people that have already collected the bumps, bruises, and t-shirts, so that you don't have to, make the same mistakes and, reinvent the mousetrap. When I was consulting, I used to talk to companies about this concept, and I said, you should always be practicing R&D. And I don't mean research and development. What I mean is rob and duplicate. Because if somebody has already figured something out, right, you don't need to go and reinvent the wheel, right? So, learn from what others are doing to accelerate your efforts. I'm not saying to go and, pillage someone's IP or illegally take something from them. But, if there's people that have been through it and have the experience, how can you learn from them to accelerate? And to me, it was a natural thing to do, because I spent 10 years leading sustainability consortiums in the Toronto area, and that's where we would get groups of companies together to share best practices, leverage learning, training, and resources to accelerate their journey towards sustainability. And I really saw the power of learning from others. So when I founded Carbon One, I figured, maybe this is something that we can do here. And, the feedback and the help that I've received from other founders, everything from the tech side to building the right team to, finding the right investor partner, things like that, they've been invaluable, for us. So thank you to all those founders who have helped us along the way.
That's a great shout out to all of them. If you had to give one tip to new founders from that experience, from your, trials and errors, and I loved how you said it before, bumps, bruises, and t-shirts, what would be that one tip that you would give?
Just keep going. You've got to keep going. You've got to keep things moving forward. There's going to be many days where you just, question whether, should I keep going? Is this going to work? There's always going to be, roadblocks. You have to sort of, as I say, throw your hat over the fence, right? So, once you've thrown your hat over the fence, you have no choice but to go and get it, right? So, just keep going. Know that there's always going to be problems. There's always going to be challenges, but you'll get past them, right? And you'll figure out a way. We've got this sort of, part of our culture and our values is, we want to, be a team of people, that figures it out, right? We call it cracking the nut, right? And, our first nut that we had to crack was, how do we simplify this, super complex scientific process? And, when we first looked at it, one of the co-founders, Panos, and I, it's, he'd been doing this for 15 years. Like, I don't know if we can crack this nut, right? And, the more you chip away at it, the easier it gets. So, you have to be able to see that long-term vision and then sort of back yourself up and understand that you can sort of get it bite by bite, right? But you can't lose sort of the forest through the trees either. Yeah. The other thing I would say is, take care of yourself as a founder, right?
Like you're talking about mentally, physically.
Yeah. I think that I heard it, many times before, and it never really registered with me until I was, a founder. And look, I founded and built a consulting company. This is completely different, another level. The consulting company was myself and some strategic partners. But founder burnout is a real thing. And you're seeing more and more of founders coming out and publicly talking about that. And you know, you need to manage yourself as a resource like you manage other resources in your business. And we're not robots either. We need rest. We need to make sure that we take care of ourselves, because if we don't take care of ourselves, who's gonna drive the bus here, right? So um, making sure you manage
Yeah.
yourself as a resource. And another thing that I've learned is that everyone likes to talk about sprints, right? And sprints are great for certain things, but when it comes to being a founder, it's a marathon, not a sprint, right? So
Probably several marathons together.
yeah, exactly, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Now, you also instated 4 days a week at Carbon One. Was that part of this to give yourself and your team a bit more of balance?
Yeah, I would say it's more for the team than the founders. But yeah, yeah,
Great.
yeah.
Okay.
So
Mhm.
we've been trying this 4-day work week thing, and
Mhm.
when we founded the company, we really wanted to walk the talk. We genuinely believe in sustainability, and sustainability goes beyond the environmental stuff, right? It touches, I shouldn't say touches. It includes social aspects and economic aspects. And from a social perspective, social sustainability includes, the overall well-being of our team. And we wanted to provide our team members
Mhm.
with more of that work-life balance, right? And the 4-day work week, just seemed to make sense to us as a way to achieve that. And we said, look, we're starting a brand new thing here. We don't have a legacy culture or legacy ways of doing things. So let's give it a shot. And decided to move forward with it. And what I'll say is it has its challenges. For us, I think they're a little bit magnified by the fact that we're also, essentially a completely remote work from home team. We do get together every now and then in person. So that sort of
Yeah.
magnifies or amplifies maybe some of the potential issues that could arise. But I will say this: the team loves it,
Mhm.
and so far the challenges haven't been anything that we can't manage. And I would say that the benefits, outweigh any of the challenges that we've seen with the 4-day work week. And I would encourage other companies to try it.
Last question I always ask my guest is about, is there a product out there that you would like to give a shout out to? It could be any product that you like using, and you think people should know about.
Yeah, I saw that on your thing, and I wasn't quite sure what to say there. I mean, the only shout out that I would like to give is to, the Canadian food and beverage companies across this country who, work hard every single day to put food on our tables. And I know that sometimes we can get frustrated with them, but the agri-food value chain is very complex. Getting food on our tables is no easy feat. And I think that we need to recognize and thank the food and beverage companies across this country for making sure that we have food that we can put on our tables every single day. They're really, don't receive the recognition that they deserve. It's a hard job, and thank you to all those food and beverage companies, ones we work with and ones that we don't.
That's a great shout out. And actually, if you have anyone specifically that is also using technology in an innovative way create their food products, to bring them to market, whatever it is. We would love to speak with them as well on the podcast.
Yeah,
So that would be great. Because you're right. We sometimes don't think about it, enough. It's almost like it's there, it's obvious. It's we're just expecting that it will always
yeah.
continue to be there. Thank you so much for coming to the show, Brett. This was a pleasure. I really enjoyed our discussion, and you know what? Our future is really in our hands at the end of the day. So we all have to chip in and help with whatever we can. So it's really amazing to see what Carbon One have built.
Yeah, and
So
thank
thank you
you for
for that.
having me on the podcast here. And I agree that every one of us can play a role, right? Sometimes we think that our little actions don't matter, but every action does matter, and cumulatively they add up to a larger impact. So encourage everyone to play their part.
Yeah, where can people reach out to you if they want to
Yeah,
learn more about
yeah.
you
You
or
can
to speak with you?
always check me out on LinkedIn. Whether it's my personal page or a company page there. You can visit us at carbon-one .ca. We're always happy to chat, and look forward to continuing the discussion. Great,
Perfect.
thank you.
Thank you so much, Brett. Take care, everyone. This was Moshe Mikanovsky again with Beyond Product. I'm happy to have you here on the show. Come again. Take care, everyone.